الكريم، السيدات والسادة، أهلا ومرحبا بكم ضيوفا أعزاء على مركز الجزيرة للحريات العامة وحقوق الإنسان في هذه الجلسة الثالثة بعنوان ضرورة الشراكة والتضامن بين المؤسسات الإعلامية والمنظمات الفرص وكذلك الآفاق. حيث تؤمن شبكة الجزيرة الإعلامية بأن اليوم العالمي لحقوق الإنسان يمثل مناسبة عالمية مهمة تحرص الشبكة سنوياً على إحيائها كل عام من خلال تنظيم ندوة لتعزيز مبادرة الشراكة والتضامن يسهم في إثرائها بالطبع أبرز خبراء وقيادات المنظمات والشبكات المعنية بحماية الصحفيين والمؤسسات الإعلامية وأصحاب الواجبات من المنظمات الدولية وممثلي السلك الدبلوماسي خاصة الدول الصديقة لسلامة
the friendly countries.
This session, as a matter of fact, will deal with the reality and the challenges
of the partnership between the media and the organizations, what's its importance and what are the achievements, practical achievements, and what are the main challenges that the joint work encounters, and what are the obstacles whereby we could emphasize the efforts to press ahead with the Universal Declaration of the Protection of Journalists in War and Peace. To answer such questions and others, I'm glad to have a constellation of experts, and they are as follows. Dorothy Tucker, the investigative reporter from the CBS2 Chicago Host Customer Service. Please, the floor is yours. John Yearwood, the president of Yearwood Media Group and the previous chairman of the IPI. Barbara Triomfi, the executive director of the IPI. Mr. Omud Mirzayev, the president of the International Eurasia Press Fund. I'd like to welcome you all. So plenty of themes that we'll be tackling in accordance with the title of this session, Building Partnership and Solidarity Between Media Organizations and International Organizations, Opportunities and Perspectives. There are plenty of challenges that such partnership encounters. I would like to allocate some minutes for every panelist, perhaps 7 to 8 minutes. I would like to start with the first guest. Sorry, my papers are mixed up. Dorothy Tucker, the investigative reporter. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to join you today for this important dialogue on the role that each of us play in addressing and standing against the challenges that we face with press freedom around the globe. Before I go any further, let me thank the Al Jazeera Center for Public Liberties and Human Rights for inviting me to join this esteemed panel. As president of the National Association of Black Journalists, I bring you greetings on behalf of 4,000 journalists of color. The journalism profession has played a crucial role in my life, and I understand the importance of protecting it and honoring it with all the resources we have available. As I sit here, I assure you that under my leadership, NABJ will be committed to being a partner alongside other organizations in spreading awareness about the war we are now facing on press freedom. I am disheartened to learn that according to the World Press Freedom Index, The number of countries regarded as safe where journalists can work in complete security continues to decline. The index reports that more and more journalists are fearful for their lives, and as a result, the number of investigative reporters worldwide is declining. As an investigative reporter for CBS in Chicago, I know about the dangers and the threats that one can face when working to unveil the truth. But unlike hundreds of courageous reporters around the world, I have not faced the threat of death or imprisonment for doing my job. My heart aches for the families of journalists who have lost their lives. I join my colleagues in demanding the release of scores of reporters who have been unjustly detained, among them Al Jazeera's own Mahmoud Hussein. Day by day, the atmosphere for journalists in the United States is becoming more dangerous as verbal, cyber, and personal attacks are not only growing, but have become encouraged by people in power. In fact, over the last 2 years, several members of the National Association of Black Journalists have been mistreated and verbally assaulted by U.S. officials for simply asking questions that the public deserves answers to. And beyond our membership, journalists across America have indeed suffered from violence, rights violations, and harassment while on the job, including censorship. As we have all heard before, numbers don't lie. And the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, led by the Freedom of the Press Foundation and the Committee to Protect Journalists in collaboration with other press freedom groups, reports that in the United States, 32 U.S. journalists have faced physical attacks in 2019. 5 were killed in 2018. 46 faced physical attacks in 2017. And since 2017, 55 U.S. reporters have been attacked while covering protest. To truly overcome the attacks our industry has encountered in the U.S. and around the world, it will indeed take meaningful and ongoing partnerships so that we may stand in solidarity against the wrongs journalists everywhere are facing for simply doing their jobs, serving the public by seeking the truth and reporting it. To help bring these issues to the forefront, NABJ is committed to using its wide-reaching platforms to share data and stories that expose unjust acts against journalists. We will activate partnerships with organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists so that we may help elevate their outstanding work and share and report on their updates on the plight of journalists. We will leverage our newsletters and digital media that reach thousands of students, journalists, communicators, influencers, educators, and news and corporate leaders nationwide. We will offer quarterly space for reporters to post stories about murdered, detained, or mistreated journalists around the globe and other infringements on press freedom. We will also partner with the Fallen Journalists Memorial Foundation and the National Press Club Journalism Institute in Washington, D.C. to ensure that the lives of journalists we have lost are not forgotten. We are also, obviously, extending NABJ support for the International Declaration of the Protection of Journalists. We recognize that there is strength in numbers and that it will take as many raised voices and daring pen strokes as possible to tear down the walls that have been built up to limit and dismantle press freedom. Building partnerships and working in unison with critical media groups and international organizations are keys to our victory. In fact, this month, we will open our 2020 edition of the NABJ Ethel Payne Fellowship that allows NABJ members to gain foreign correspondence experience in Africa. We make these commitments with knowledge that we live in a time where the journalism industry should be growing and not dissolving. We need more eyes, ears, and voices on the field to ensure that the facts are available for everyone. A few months ago, NABJ celebrated 2 journalists of color who've used their platforms, their voices, and their pens to not only report on issues citizens are facing globally, but also in the government interference and intimidation that journalists are encountering. Karen Attiah, our Journalist of the Year for 2019, was honored during our annual convention in August. The Washington Post Global Opinions editor boldly used her platform in the pages of her opinions section to sound the alarm on the disappearance and subsequent murder of her colleague, Jamal Khashoggi. NABJ also honored Pap Sain, co-publisher and managing editor of the Point newspaper in the Gambia, West Africa, as the recipient of the 2019 Percy Barbosa Foreign Journalist of the Year award. Like others, Sain has been arrested, criminally charged, and imprisoned for simply doing his job as a reporter. At NEBJ, we recognize that at any time, any of our members and colleagues could find themselves victims of violence, harassment, torture, imprisonment, and even death for no more than simply being good reporters. I've always believed and known that journalists can change the world through their work. We must stand united and without waver, work hand in hand to discover new ways to speak truth to power. NEBJ stands ready and determined to ensure that journalists can continue to change the world for hundreds of years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. شكرا لك يا السيدة دورothy توكر رئيسة اتحاد الصحفيين السود في أمريكا على هذه الكلمة وعلى الالتزام
Tucker, for abiding by the time, plenty of statistics and plenty of figures pertinent to the journalists in the USA and the mechanisms thereby in order to break the obstacles of freedom of expression. We'll move now to Mr. John Yearwood, the Yearwood Media Group, and the previous chairman of the IPI. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I want to take a minute to thank Dr. Mustafa Sawaj, my friends Sami and Hassan for the invitation to return to Doha to address these very important issues. And of course, it's always good to see a lot of my friends in the audience. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
On the morning of August 31st, 2006, I was jolted awake by a ringing telephone. On the other end was the girlfriend of my senior reporter in Latin America, and at the time, I was the world editor of the Miami Herald. The news that she was sharing with me is something that any foreign editor dreads. She called to say that our correspondent had been missing for 12 hours. And more than likely, he was taken by the Venezuelan government. Over the next 48 hours were among the most intense that I've had at the Miami Herald. It involved a series of negotiations with people in Venezuela, people in Washington, and elsewhere. Also involved an emergency trip of mine to Caracas, not only to locate our reporter, but also to help secure his freedom. It also included a visit to one of the black sites, if you will, or one of the prisons that few people had heard about where he was being held. The prison, by the way, was hiding in plain sight in Caracas. Over those 48 hours and through the negotiations, we thankfully were able to get Jim released from prison in Caracas. And we were able to do that thanks to the help of a number of international organizations, such as the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, IPI, International Press Institute, the Inter-American Press Association, and others, because they sounded the alarm that our journalist was kidnapped. Well, internally, we looked at it as being kidnapped, but in fact, was being taken by the Venezuelan government. And as we talk about working with international organizations, I think that's a really good example of why it is so critical that journalists and journalism companies and media companies ought to create relationships, collaborations with various organizations, international organizations, because you never know when that relationship will yield dividends, as it did with us. So permit me over the next few minutes to discuss 3 areas where I think journalists should seek out or take advantage of those partnerships to help combat the times we are in, where we are seeing escalating attacks on the media, certainly not only in the US, but around the world. There are 3 areas that, 3 suggestions, if you will, that I think we need to look at is 1, look for the outstretched hand. Again, look for the outstretched hand. It's you cannot ignore the fact that organizations such as within the United Nations, such as the Human Rights Commission or UNESCO, have been doing a great job in working with various journalism media companies on their behalf, especially when a journalist has been taken. But in recent years, I think we need to look for who else is available and who else has been doing work in that area. Within the United Nations itself, one organization is the UN Alliance of Civilizations. A few years ago, I was invited by UNAOC to attend one of its conferences in Egypt. And certainly, and we've been talking about that over the last 24 hours or so here at this conference, the arrest in Egypt of Al Jazeera's Mahmoud Hussein. It gave me an opportunity in Cairo to call for Mahmoud Hussein to be released in a conference attended by a number of Egyptian officials. So what we had is organizations like UNAOC offering opportunities for us to work with them on press freedom, organizations that historically we would not expect to be active in that space. So when I say look for the outstretched hands, we need to look for opportunities such as was afforded by UNAOC. Another thing that we need to look at is do not ignore the coalition of the willing. And to some extent here, I'm talking about governments. I know in many of our newsrooms, and indeed in many of our organizations, it may seem as a dirty word to be depending to some extent on some governments. But we have seen in recent years, particularly since last July, when Canada and the UK came together to organize a conference in London that looked at issues of press freedom. And a lot has come out of that, or at least from what we understand, a lot ultimately will come out of that, and there's a lot of work being discussed, or a lot is being worked on because of those meetings. So in that sense, it was refreshing to see, but it doesn't mean that in every area, both the governments of the UK and Canada are working in our best interests. But I think in areas where they are, we should participate and see if we can take advantage of those opportunities, because it is in many of these governments self-interest, and when they do, we should embrace those opportunities. And another area that I think we need to look at is to truly become our brother's keeper. And by that I mean we must not ignore the fact that we must be better partners and collaborators with each other. And in the various, among the various media houses. One of the things that we did when I was chairman of IPI is that we started the Foreign Editors Circle where we brought together foreign editors from around the United States, Canada, and at times Mexico, to talk about how we can work together, how we can collaborate together. And I think we don't see enough of that. And I think it's very important that we work together so that in many cases, only through working together we can really make significant contributions towards free press and free expression. You know, we are at a critical juncture in the work to protect and defend journalists' rights to practice our craft without fear or favor. Have we found these times that we are in, or have these times found us? Either way, this time, I think, has created unique opportunities, and I firmly believe that we must seize those opportunities. Shukran.
شكرا للسيد جون ييروود رئيس مجموعة ييروود الإعلامية ورئيس السابق لمجلس إدارة المعهد الدولي للصحافة والذي أضاء في الحقيقة على أهمية الشراكة بين المؤسسات الإعلامية والمنظمات التي تعنى بحماية الصحفيين خصوصا في عالمنا الحالي الذي يعيشها اليوم انطلاقا من حادثة عاشها أو عايشها هو نفسه هو شخصيا عندما اختطف أحد صحفيين من قبل الحكومة الفنزويلية كما نحييك أيضا على إطلاق هذه الدعوة الصريحة لإطلاق زميلنا محمود حسين من داخل مصر في Venezuelan authorities,
and thank you, Mr. Yearwood, for your call for the release of our colleague Mahmoud Hussein when you were in Cairo. Thank you. Now we go to Ms. Barbara Trionti. She is the Executive Director at the Vienna-based International Press Institute. We know you have a flight to catch by 4:30, so we will try and enable her to leave immediately after her intervention.
We are all very much aware about what the violations, the media freedom violations that exist out there, the type of obstacles that journalists face, and it is acknowledged that they are not legitimate, and yet, and on the other hand, we're working with a number of countries, UN member states, basically the whole world, that have made a number of commitments, and they're failing to stand up to those, which is why also the declaration is a very good reminder to those commitments that they have indeed made. How can we close this gap? How can we make sure that there is accountability for those governments and state representatives who do not live up to their commitments? And this is a question that certainly IPI and other organizations keep asking themselves. How can we change things on the ground? We are in daily contact with our members around the world, journalists and editors who inform us about various obstacles they are encountering, and on the other hand, how can we bring about positive change? What has worked where, and how can we reiterate any of the success stories? So in thinking about all of this and trying to, is our effort to strategize, we found that there are three elements that we feel need to be in place for a successful campaign to be, for a campaign to be successful, for our ability to bring about things. On any press freedom violation case, we need to have the international community on board. These are the international organizations from UN to regional governmental bodies, the UNESCO, those that have a mandate in this area. They need to be on board in order to make sure that what we are talking about is not perceived as an opinion, IPI said that, but it's based on internationally agreed standards and norms. And we need also, and the international community does not only include, of course, the IGOs, the governmental organization, is also the community of civil society organizations, press freedom groups, journalist associations, all of those that work very often also together to promote and to give visibility to certain cases and to bring about change. And we do come together very often. We do come together on different campaigns, on different, we know the players out there, we know each other, we work together very well. So, and yet there is a lot of work. So we need to pick our cases on when do we create strong coalitions also together with international organizations on a certain case. But the other two elements that are also very much needed, we need the international community of journalists to give international visibility to these cases. IPI and other organizations similar to ours, we are not in contact with the peoples out there. We're not in contact, we don't speak the languages of governments around the world, or not all of them. We need local media in a number of countries and local journalists, and that's why your suggestion, Dorothy, to also reach out to your community in the United States is great. We need the local journalists to bring this issue to the attention of their governments and ask their governments to intervene on a case on a violation committed by another country. It is government typically respond to their voters, so they will respond to their community, to their local community more than anything else. So in the moment, the journalists in the United States, for example, though that's a difficult case at the moment, will successfully bring a case to the attention of the government and ensure that the government feels that they need to intervene on a certain issue. On the case of Mahmoud Hussein, again, very complicated diplomatically, but that's when things start moving. And these are the cases where we have seen some successes to ensure that various governments around the world become active and use their diplomatic tools also to put pressure. And thirdly, we need a strong, thank you very much, thank you, a strong local community of journalists in the country where the violation is taking place. We need the local journalists to cover it, to be able to cover it, and to be able to give visibility to these violations. And because again, governments respond to their own citizens, to their own voters. So if the voters will also put pressure on the government, it is possible that some change will happen. And yet in many of these countries, local journalists are scared to bring up certain cases. Covering the killing of a journalist very often means angering those who have killed that journalist in the first place. Same for arrests and similar cases. So there is a lot of censorship, self-censorship, which is inevitable when these conditions of fear are brought about. And so it is what, in our experience, is much easier for journalists who work in a very restricted environment and work under conditions of fear to cover violations in the moment they say, this is not our story, but we're just repeating the story that somebody else covered somewhere else. We are repeating what the New York Times has covered. We're repeating what IPI said, what CPJ said. And that really limits the level of danger that they would face if this was perceived as their own story, their own opinion on this issue. So these are the three elements that we always try to put in place, and it's not always easy because it depends on so many conditions. It depends on the ability, on the willingness of states to put in place diplomatic tools. It depends on really the existence of a journalistic community on the ground that can be strong and vocal enough and all of that. But in our experience, this has been the recipe for success. And I'm talking of course, in a context where successes are very few and rare, and yet very, very important. Thank you.
شكرا لك. شكرا للسيدة باربرا تريومفي المديرة التنفيذية للمعهد.
Thank you, Barbara
التي
Tianfi, the
تحدثت
Executive
كما
Director
قالت هي عن
of the Division of Freedom of
وصفة النجاح
Expression and
لهذه
Media
الحملات،
Development. She
حملات
gave us a
التعاون
recipe
بين
for success when it
بين
comes to
المؤسسات
the
الإعلامية والمنظمات
operation campaigns
الدولية لأن تكون هذه
between the
الحملات
media and the international
ناجحة. أهمية
organizations
التعاون ربما
and the
تحدثت عن
importance
عدة عناصر أو
of such
عوامل
cooperation. She provided us
أهمها
with a number
هو
of
التواصل مع المجتمعات
elements,
المحلية في
especially
كل دولة حينما
to
يتعذر التعاون أو التواصل مع
communicate with
حكومات
the community
الدول.
if
تحديات كثيرة
communicating with the
تحدثت
government
عنها
is
ننقلها
not
الآن إلى
feasible.
السيد أوموند
We'll move
مرزييف رئيس
to
الصندوق
Mr.
الأوروبي
Omod
الآسيوي
Marzaev,
لحرية
the
الصحافة.
President of the
ربما
International
هناك
Eurasia
المزيد من
Press
هذه
Fund.
التحديات التي يمكن الإضاءة
Please,
عليها.
the floor is yours. Yes, please. Пожалуйста.
First of all, I would like thanks Al Jazeera for organizing this event, and especially Dr. Mustafa Shor and Samia Al-Haj. Dear participants, colleagues and friends, now more than ever, there is a strong need for local media organizations and international organizations to come together in partnership to support the protection of press freedom and fundamental human rights. The journalists constantly risk their lives in search of truth despite the existing declarations, resolutions, and documents aimed at protecting of their rights. The international organizations that have to support countries' development also face operation, if not similar challenges as media organizations. We saw this. At the end of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union was accompanied by numerous ethnic conflicts in the Caucasus, the Baltic countries, Chechnya, Central Asia, and several post-Soviet countries. It was mostly felt in Karabakh. During the Armenia-Azerbaijan Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, during the period of aggressive policy of Armenia against Azerbaijan, and the occupation of 20% of the territory of our country, seven foreign and local journalists were killed. The organizers of these crimes faced no consequences and even took the leading positions. Today, we also see journalists and even humanitarian workers targeted in places such as Syria, Pakistan, Mexico, Philippines, Afghanistan, in Africa and other countries. Being International Eurasia Press Fund, we believe that the development of partnership and solidarity between media, civil society organizations, and international organizations will help to protect media workers and freedom of information. I know this firsthand because this is the International Eurasia Press Fund model, which I have, together with some of foreign media colleagues, used 30 years ago in establishing these organizations. Since the beginning of the 90s, we have organized visits of more than 100 foreign journalists to hotspots. This practice continues today. Only this year, frontline regions were visited by journalists from Qatar, US, Israel, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Ukraine, and several other countries. Not once we came under fire. IPF has good experience in providing first aid development, safety rules, technical standards, operation procedures, and other related issues. We continuously organize and participate in various campaigns for journalist protection. One of them was the one organized by Al Jazeera in November 2017. Being member of the UN agency, ECOSOC, International Peace Bureau, and International Press Institute, with whose representative I have the honor to participate in this panel today, will always approach all these issues with responsibility. We had a chance to contribute to the creation of national committees of the International Press Institute in Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. However, the process did not advance because there was no acceptable support from international structures. There are different factors that negatively affect the media cooperation with international organizations. Unequal approach to countries, public distrust in certain organizations, absences of accuracy and bias and transparency issues. Some countries have problems with media development and the protection of the rights of journalists. However, sometimes we see how international structures even condemn the countries that are trying to eliminate these problems. If international organizations cannot form a fair and unbiased approach to each country, this leads to creation problems. In a case with Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict and the cooperation and the occupation by Armenia of Nagorno-Karabakh and 7 surrounded regions, the way international organizations approach has made public appointed the lack of a unified approach by the world media and international organizations to condemn acts of aggression against Azerbaijan, including the killing of journalists, undermine confidence in the effectiveness of such cooperations. Dear colleagues and friends, I take this opportunity to participate in such an event in which representatives of important international structures are also present to encourage all participants to join forces and work together to raise awareness of the need to manage cooperation between the international organization and media organizations in a fair and unbiased approach to all countries. Thanks for your attention.
شكرا لك سيد أمود مرزاييف رئيس الصندوق الأوروبي.
Mr. Ahmad Mirzayev, for your intervention. You spoke about the importance of organizing joint campaigns with other stakeholders to protect the freedom of speech and the freedom of journalism, because these freedoms, after all, are the cornerstone for protecting the rest of human rights. Now we open the floor for questions and answers. See if there are any questions directed at our speakers. Good afternoon. My name is Zaid Ben Yamin. I'm a blogger. My question to Barbara, she left as I know, but she spoke about the importance of communities and the general public taking part in protecting our freedoms in view of the loss of confidence, the deficit in confidence in people's confidence in journalism. Can our societies and communities really move in order to influence governments to do something by way of protecting journalists and the freedom of expression, especially in the United States, when we see the president himself attacking journalists. Thank you.
السؤال موجه لمن؟ باربرا؟
أي أمريكي في البانel.
يعني تطرق
The
للمبادرة.
question is to any American in the panel. Barbara has gone on.
You can answer that. Okay, سيد.
You know, what I see, I think the answer to that
الإجابة عن السؤال في رأيي
like NABJ can make a difference. You know, as I mentioned, because of the reach that we have, because we have 4,000 journalists, throughout the last couple of days, I have heard many of you talk about the need for public support, and you mentioned public support. So imagine if our organization would put one of the stories on Facebook, we put it on Twitter, we put it in our bulletin. When you talk about the reach, now you're talking about not just journalists who work for national networks or national newspapers or magazines. You're talking about those journalists who are also in middle America, who are in small towns. They see that story, they repost it, they retweet that story. Now your reach has grown. You know, so now when you think of public opinion, there is an opportunity for that woman who lives in Jackson, Mississippi, to read that story of someone who is detained in Gambia and has a relative, has a connection, and wants to now know more. Now that person says, hey, to their local officials, now they become more in tune. Now they begin to pay more attention. And you know, that's the strength of what an organization like NABJ can bring to this effort. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we are here.
Okay. Let me also add to that. You mentioned that this deficit that we've been seeing in public trust of the media, et cetera. I think certainly what we have is a president who doesn't miss an opportunity to criticize the media. But let me say that presidents and others have been criticizing the media probably for as long as we've had presidents. But also we're seeing more of it now, a particular hatred, if you will. But on the other side, I would argue what we have seen is the public responding, I would say perhaps more in favor of the media than against. Just for example, look at the kind of support that major US publications, the Washington Post and New York Times, the spikes that they have seen in their circulation numbers of the public wanting more of what we produce. Look, for example, at CPJ and what happened a few years ago when Meryl Streep at the Oscars talked about press freedom and said to donate to organizations like CPJ. Joel got so much money he didn't know what to do with it all. So we are seeing the public responding in ways that to some extent you won't expect, but I think for the most part, we also have a lot of support from the public.
Thank you. تفضل. But let me just highlight something. Talker, you were talking about social media. تحدثينا فقط عن التواصل الاجتماعي، كيف يمكن التعامل مع المجتمعات المحلية في إطار التواصل الاجتماعي، لكن في كثير من الأحيان هناك أيضا
there will be attacks by the local community against the media through the social media outlets. So how can we strike a balance between, on the one hand, cooperating and relying on the local community, and how media outlets can protect themselves against such attacks? لم أفهم ما هو
التعاون. تقولين بأنه
You say that there is an element of relying on local communities or cooperating with local communities in this partnership. You spoke about the social media through retweeting stories.
لكن قد يكون هناك
But
وجه آخر هو
there may be another
إن كان هذا
face
المجتمع
to
المحلي
this,
لا يتفق مع
and
وجهة
in
النظر
case the
الصحفية
local
مع وجهة
community
النظر
disagrees
الصحفية
with
أو
the
مع
point of view
الصحافة في
of
مكان معين في
journalism
الولايات المتحدة أو
in the
غيرها،
United States
كيف
or
يمكن
elsewhere,
حماية نفس
how
هذه
can
المؤسسة
the
الإعلامية أو هذا
media protect
الإعلامي؟
itself in this case?
How can the media protect itself?
كيف يمكن
I'm struggling just a little bit to understand
how
your question.
can we activate this kind of collaboration between
Between
us, between us as media organizations, and also between the people, the community, in a way, also to protect ourselves as media.
Well, I think I'm going to piggyback kind of what John said. You know, I think there is more of a trust of the media.
But what our guest was asking is, in the light of losing this trust, that trust is not.
I'm sorry, I'm sitting there. Now I can hear you.
هذه الثقة مفقودة. هذه
No.
الثقة في مجتمع. Oh, sorry.
My apologies. I took them off.
نعم هو قال في ظل let me speak in Arabic right now. Let me speak in Arabic if you would like to just في ظل تراجع هذه الثقة. And you know he was speaking, actually, if I may repeat your words, he was speaking about the mistrust between these communities and media outlets. How can you activate this collaboration? Improve it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think John kind of touched on that. I mean, I don't quite honestly think that there is as much mistrust as you are indicating that there might be, or that the gentleman is indicating that there might be. I mean, as somebody who works in local television, I think that there is quite a bit of trust in the local media. I mean, I think what you're seeing is something that plays out on a national level. And you see the national news. But I can tell you, as someone who works in Chicago, I don't really, as a whole, get a sense that there is a distrust of what we do in Chicago or what we do in St. Louis or Jackson, Mississippi. I think it's the exact opposite. You know, I think that the communities look for their local journalists and they expect them to investigate and uncover the wrongs and expose. They expect them to be that fourth estate, and they actually, there's really a sense of trust. You know, there's an expectation that the local media is really going to unveil the truths, because these are people who are vested in the community. These are people who live in the community. So it's somewhat different than I think the portrayal that you might have of what you see nationally. Locally, I think it's very different.
Can I add a bit to what Dorothy said? I agree. You know, there is a level of, to some extent, there's a level of distrust, but that's not new. There's always been, in my view, a level of distrust against the media. But I don't want it to be, seen as that's the overarching storyline, because I think a lot of people still trust the media, as, and I mentioned earlier what we've seen at some of the major newspapers. But I think what we're seeing now, because of the times that we're in, there's more noise about it because you have a president that empowers people to say what they want or say anything, and to some extent do anything which creates a lot of this noise, and it's to some extent the dog bites man syndrome, because that's where you see a lot of the media attention and others, because of what we've been seeing in terms of even in some communities where there have been some attacks against the media. In fact, the media tracker that CPJ and others have, it is showing that in communities around the country, we're seeing more attacks against the media. There's no doubt that there's more of it now than before, but we hadn't been measuring it as deeply as we are now in years before, when there were also attacks against the media. But I think what we need to keep in mind is that, and this is again is to pick up on what Dorothy said, we are also seeing a lot of trust among the local community for their journalists. And here's one example. I live in Miami. You're all familiar with the stories about the Epstein story in the U.S. About the attack, the rape allegation, et cetera. He eventually committed suicide in jail. Well, that story was broken by a local investigative reporter in Miami. And I follow her on Twitter. You should see the kind of reaction that the public, what they've been saying on her various timelines. There's a very, very appreciative public out there for the work that we do. And I think you see more of that, the more work that, great work that we do.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. Thank you. تفضل.
تحياتي لكم جميعا، وأتمنى أنه يساعدني المترجم في إيصال فكرتي. سؤالي هو عن صحافة المواطن.
Is about the citizen journalism. We in Sinai in Egypt, the regime has more or less completely restricted the work of the media, which turned the citizen into the source for any news. Many citizens in the Sinai have been arrested simply because they were caught carrying mobile phones and sending reports or news items. Human Rights Watch recorded a lot of crimes against humanity, forced expulsion of people and others. What can we do about this citizen who had to do this because nobody else is allowed to do the work of journalism, and they are marginalized anyway? Nobody cares about them or their area, and nobody considers them even as part of the Middle East. Thank you. To whom are you directing your question? To everyone, please. It's a general question. So how can we deal with the citizen journalist model in these circumstances?
That's a really good question. And because you ask about something that we've been discussing in various circles like this one and others for a long time, about what responsibility do we have to citizen journalists? Because in many cases, they bear the greatest risk. They're working in areas that journalists who work for recognized organizations are unwilling to go because it is just too dangerous, which is one of the reasons why we have this declaration that we've been talking about here for some time. There's a part of the declaration that deals with how you respond to citizen journalists who are, citizen journalists, and how we help protect them. One of the things that we have seen in recent years, particularly after the barbaric attack on freelance journalists, is that we needed to be, as a journalistic community, we needed to come together to offer some protections to freelancers, namely, in many cases, citizen journalists who are working to report in areas where it's almost impossible for other journalists to go. So I think without doubt that major news organizations, actually any news organization that, that hire or work with citizen journalists, they have a responsibility to do everything that they can to protect these journalists. And again, that's one of the things we've been talking about. That's why this declaration is so important.
Dorothy?
That's a difficult question to answer because, you know, I think of a citizen journalist in particular in Chicago who was murdered, and we suspect it was because of the work that he was doing. You know, I can think of some others who I know there are stories that we would not have had it not been for citizen journalists who went in and kept pushing and did the work. I mean, one of the cases that you probably are aware of on a national level is Laquan McDonald, who was shot 16 times in Chicago. It was a citizen journalist who uncovered that story. So, you know, I mean, there's a part of me that says, you know, like John, we have to support them. We have to support them because we need them. But at the same time, how do you really protect them when they are not necessarily affiliated with an organization? You know, so there's you know, perhaps one way, as I think off the top of my head, is, you know, if there is a way for a major news outlet to offer some kind of an outlet, you know, some kind of protection, but it's the solution to that is difficult. I think, as one of the panelists said earlier today, what we really need to do is to figure out how to find more funding to support all journalists, but in particular those community journalists who are not getting paid for what they do and are risking their lives to get at the truth. You know, I mean, they're someone who I really admire community journalists for that reason.
هناك سؤال تفضل عفوا في ميكروفون.
بسم الله عادل الباز رئيس تحرير جريدة الأحداث السودانية. ظلينا كل سنة في مثل هذا اليوم نردد أو ندعو إلى تحالف. أنا لفت نظري كلام الأستاذ، التحالف بين المؤسسات الإعلامية، التحالف بين المنظمات المدافعة عن حرية.
Talked about alliances between the media and the international organization, but this is kind of, if you allow me, hot air, if I might say. We cannot reach this call. Every year we repeat the same thing. We say that we need to extend the bridges with the international organizations. I would like just a comment on this, please. Thank you.
شكرا لك. سيدة Dorothy Tucker. Would you like to
Was
answer
it
this
for
question?
Dorothy or was for anyone?
لمن السؤال موجه؟ للسيد أمود Мерзаев.
Omad Berzaev, это вопрос к вам.
Самир,
Давайте.
вопрос еще раз. Говорите, пожалуйста.
هل لدينا مترجم؟ هل بالإمكان ترجمة؟ لا مترجم.
Я слушаю. Я, в принципе, говорил об этом в своем выступлении. Это один из важнейших моментов. Дело в том, что и международные структуры, и местные local организации
Ata deməli deyir ki, Biz hər il belə tədbirlər keçirdirik, amma koalisiyanın qurulması haqqında danışırıq. Yəni nəyə görə belə bir koalisiya qurulmur? Beynəlxalq təşkilatlar və media təşkilatları arasında belə bir koalisiyanın qurulmamaq səbəbini soruşur.
Faktiki olarak bu problem həqiqətən də var. Bu hər kəsi narahat eləyir. Belə bir koalisiyanın olmaması hər kəsi narahat eləyir. Fərqli yanaşmalar var prosesə, fərqli yanaşmalar var belə bir şəbəkənin formalaşmasında.
There are different approach to those coalition. Everybody wants to different approach, but until now there is no certain move and to create such coalition as you asked. So your question was, why don't we have this coalition between media organizations and international organizations, right? So he's saying that every year we talk about it, you are right, but there are different approaches, but there is no certain move to do that. He's asking why. Deyir nəyə görə yoxdur?
Ona görə ki, çoxsaylı beynəlxalq təşkilatlar var və hər təşkilatın da öz pozisiyası var. Yerli təşkilatlar var. Bunların da müxtəlif pozisiyaları var. Çox maraqlı bir dövrdə yaşayırıq. İndiki dövr əslinə qalanda ölkələrin sanki müəyyən bir siyasiləşmə var bu beynəlxalq təşkilatların özündə də.
In his opinion, there are also international organizations also have politicization, so they have their own politics, so that can be the reason why they are not coming together.
شكرا. سؤال أخير فقط هنا وننهي.
Pozisiyası var. Her teşkilatın öz pozisiyası var.
الميكروفون وراءك.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hussein Hubaddin Zamzami. I'm a journalist originally. I'm the chairperson for the Arabic Australian Journalists in Victoria. I'm glad today I just joining this conference, and it's an opportunity for me to talk as well because my background is from Eritrea, and the darkness place for journalists is Eritrea. So what we have is, as an Eritrean journalist, one of the other. If you write one single things about inside movement or good things or bad things about Eritrea, where is government land is, you are a spy for the government. If you talk about what the government doing bad things, you are a spy for the outside. So we don't have a true journalist as Eritrean, because he cannot write for both sides what's going on there. In that case, how do we call ourselves journalists? Because some of us is for the government, and some of us, the outside, who are against the government. So we do not have, till now, one Eritrean journalist who can be independent and write the truth about the both sides. How we can manage this? Because we didn't find the true journalist yet. So everyone call us a spy. The side of the government, they call the Eritrean journalist, you are a spy. For the opposition, and the opposition side, if you write anything truth to the public, they call you a spy for the government. We really suffer for these issues, and I don't know how we can get over it. Thank you.
Thank you, shukran. So you are spy in both ways.
Yeah.
Double spy.
Yeah, that's... I would probably actually have more questions for you, because that's got to be extremely difficult. You know, so I mean, I can only advise journalists to continue to do what they do, because you know what's in your heart. You know what you're doing, and you know that you're doing the right thing. So, but I would imagine that is very difficult to know that you're going to be attacked from one side or the other for what you do. But I don't know. I will yield to those more familiar with in the space.
Well, actually, I want to respond to your question, but also let me just also respond to the question of the gentleman behind you who talked about Sudan. When I was talking about the collaborations, I do understand that it's exceedingly difficult in Sudan to form some of these collaborations. I was in Khartoum not too long ago, and I know firsthand how difficult it is to do that. And, you know, and happy to talk to you for a bit after, so that happy to strategize with you about how we can, how you can go about forming some of these collaborations and what organizations might be available to you. In terms of Eritrea, let me just say that what's happening in Eritrea is deeply disappointing with journalists in your country. There was some hope for in Eritrea after the civil war ended that maybe we would see some kind of political pluralism and more of an effort on behalf of a free press in your country. Of course, as you know, that was quickly snuffed out, and as a result, you have many journalists not only are in jail, but many of them are suffering deeply in jail. What I think that organizations such as IPI and others ought to continue to do is to call out the government for continuing to prosecute and persecute the journalists in your country. But then I think there's also a role to play for you and others who are advocating on behalf of the journalists in Sudan. And I've seen the pictures of journalists being attacked and the assaults, the beatings, what have you, of journalists there. I think that you need to continue to speak out as you're speaking out. I think clearly over the last 30 years, we haven't seen the kind of progress that many of us had hoped. But I don't think that you and others should give up. Indeed, I don't think anyone who are interested in not only political pluralism in Eritrea, but also to see a free press take root there, ought to give up. So just keep doing what you're doing.
شكرا لك سيد جون ييرود رئيس مجموعة ييرود الإعلامية ورئيس السابق لمجلس إدارة المعهد الدولي للصحافة. أتمنى أن يكون ذلك يجيب على سؤالك فيما يتعلق بجاسوسية ربما الصحافي عندما يكتب باتجاه أو يحسب ربما على جهة معينة. على العموم فقط لضيق الوقت.
In any case, because the time is tight, we have
الندوة التي كانت بعنوان ضرورة
to
الشراكة
conclude
والتضامن
this
بين
session
المؤسسات
entitled
الإعلامية
Building
والمنظمات
Partnership and
الفرص
Solidarity between Media Organizations and International Ones,
نشكر المشاركين فيها
Opportunities and
السيدة
Perspectives.
دورothy
Thank
توكر
Dorothy
رئيسة اتحاد
Tucker
الصحفيين السود في أمريكا، جون ييرود
and John
الرئيس السابق
Yearwood,
لمجلس إدارة المعهد الدولي رئيس مجموعة ييرود الإعلامية.
as well as
كذلك كانت معنا السيدة باربرا تريونفي المديرة التنفيذية للمعهد الدولي للصحافة التي اضطرت للمغادرة مبكرا بسبب رحلتها، والسيد أمود ميرزاييف رئيس الصندوق الأوروبي الآسيوي لحرية الصحافة. شكرا لكم الحضور الكريم على هذه المشاهدة أو الحضور، وشكرا لمشاهدينا الكرام أيضا على المتابعة. إلى اللقاء.
قتل الصحفيين جريمة. Oni koji ih ubijaju, odnosno proganjaju, ne smiju ostati nekažnjeni.
Uluslararası toplum gazetecilere insan hakları ihlalleri, ırk ayrımcılığı ve hukukun üstünlüğü tanımaması yönelik haber yapmak için güvenli ortamı sağlamalıdır.
فلنتضامن من أجل حماية الصحفي.
علينا توفير بيئة آمنة للعمل الصحفي لترسيخ حقوق الإنسان وحرياته وسيادة حكم القانون.
Državama ne smije biti dozvoljeno da bez odgovornosti proganjaju novinare. Lack of accountability spreads a culture of intimidation and silences the voice of truth. We call upon the United Nations. نطالب الأمم المتحدة. Apeliram na Ujedinjene narode.
Birleşmiş Milletleri çağırıyoruz.
نطالب الأمم المتحدة
to adopt the international